Hello, everyone. So my name is Ashley, and I'm a dietetic intern, and I wanted to welcome you to the Blood Pressure Self-Monitoring Program Nutrition Seminar. So today's topic is going to be all about shopping, preparing, and cooking food for better blood pressure management. So this is just an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to go over some nutrition, blood pressure facts. I'm going to talk about food labels and shopping for blood pressure friendly foods. And then once you have those foods, how to prepare and cook them for better blood pressure management. And then we're going to go over some salts, herbs, and spices as well. So as I've mentioned in previous seminars, nutrition choices have a direct impact on blood pressure. So we really want to eat a variety of nutritious foods from all food groups. So that includes fruits and vegetables, whole grains, low-fat dairy products, poultry, fish, lean meats, and nuts, and definitely choosing foods that are lower in sodium, saturated, and trans fats. So one thing you can do is look for the heart check mark on certain products. So the American Heart Association developed this heart check mark. So when you see that symbol on food packaging, it means that the product meets the American Heart Association's criteria for saturated fat, trans fat, sodium, cholesterol, and other important nutrients for a single serving of that food product for healthy people over the age of 2. So that's just something that you can look out for and kind of ease your mind and take off some of that extra work that we have to do when we're shopping. So that heart check mark is definitely useful, and I would definitely recommend looking for that if there's certain products that have that on there. All right. So the food we choose can have a big impact on the amount of sodium we consume. As we well know, only about 11% of the salt in our food comes from what we add, like that table salt that we add after cooking, or that we sometimes add to boiling water when we're cooking pasta or something. But 77% of the salt we consume is added to food during processing. So this makes it difficult for a lot of people to reduce salt intake on their own if they consume a high amount of processed foods. So virtually all Americans really do consume too much sodium. Sodium intake should stay between 1,500 to 2,300 milligrams per day. But unfortunately, the average sodium intake for an American is around 3,700 milligrams per day. So that's definitely a lot higher than what we recommend. But there are a lot of ways and a lot of products that are on the market now that kind of help with these low sodium diets that we're trying to adhere to, which is really helpful and kind of makes it a little easier to reduce our sodium intake. All right, so when we're shopping, planning meals and making a list ahead of time can help prevent you from straying from that grocery list. If you eat before you shop, you will be less likely to buy higher fat and higher sodium foods. I know when I go to the grocery store on an empty stomach, I tend to buy a lot of junk food and a lot more than what I had originally planned. So eating before you go to the grocery store can definitely help. Buying fresh foods. So fresh foods contain more vitamins, minerals, and fiber than the packaged versions. If you buy convenience foods like the pre-made foods or like the frozen TV dinner type foods, make sure that they are low fat and or low sodium to kind of make them a little healthier. Stick to the perimeter of the store where you'll find fresh fruits and vegetables, low-fat dairy and lean meats. The center aisles offer a lot more processed, high sodium, high fat packaged foods. I mean, there are low sodium options, but generally when you shop around the perimeter of the store, you'll find like the dairy and the meat and all the produce, which are definitely less processed and are going to have less fat and less sugar, and definitely less sodium. Cutting back on frozen dinners, pizza, packaged mixes, canned soups or broths, and salad dressing. That can help reduce your sodium intake because those products tend to just have a lot of sodium in them through their processing. And then, as I mentioned, choose the convenience like the TV dinner, frozen, prepackaged meals that are lower in sodium. And many ready-to-eat cereals have a lot of sodium in them too, so just be mindful of that. Like the instant oatmeal that comes in the box, instead of just buying like the oats. Those also have a lot of sugar in them, so that's just something to be mindful of. All right. So this is kind of just like a this or that scenario. So what we want to do to eat a little healthier is to choose more often the grilled or baked chicken and turkey. Try to remove that skin, because the skin on the turkey and the chicken has a lot of saturated fat, which we don't want to eat too much of, because that can raise our cholesterol and not be so healthy. Choose more often fresh fish or rinsed canned fish, such as tuna or sardines. I do recommend when you're buying the canned fish, like tuna, to buy the tuna that's in water instead of the tuna that's in oil. It's just a little fewer calories, because there are a lot of calories in oil, unfortunately. So choosing the canned fish that's in water is definitely going to help. Buying the low sodium canned foods and the low sodium or reduced sodium cheeses. And then low salt or salt-free chips, nuts, and pretzels. Those are going to drastically reduce our sodium intake. Choose more often the plain rice, noodles, or pasta. That way you can kind of control how much sauce you're putting on, or how much butter you're putting on them. And choose more often homemade low sodium or reduced sodium soups. I know Campbell's does a really good job with their labeling. A lot of like their chicken noodle soup and their tomato soup have that like heart healthy kind of stamp on their label, which generally means there's a little bit less sodium and there's a little bit less saturated and trans fat in the soup. So that's something to watch out for. Same thing with like your chicken broth and your vegetable broth and your beef broth. Choosing the lower sodium options, and they even have like the unsalted options, which can definitely help reduce our sodium intake when we choose the low sodium or unsalted versions. And then if you are adding salt, you can control how much you add so you don't add too much. Choose more often the fresh, frozen, no salt added, or rinsed canned vegetables. If like the no salt added versions aren't available, I would definitely recommend rinsing those vegetables before you eat them. That can drastically reduce the amount of sodium you're consuming. And then spices, herbs, and flavorings, such as cilantro, parsley, garlic powder, onion powder, vinegar, chili powder. Those are all going to be low sodium options. I know I've mentioned a few times those spice blends that I like. So the Mrs. Dash brand, that has the no salt added spice blends, and then as well as the Perfect Pinch brand has a few that are no salt added, but the Perfect Pinch ones, not all of the spice blends are no salt added, so just be careful and look at the labels. So then choosing less often. So we want to kind of limit the amount of smoked and cured meats and the processed like deli meats like bacon, ham, sausage, hot dogs, bologna, ham hocks, all that kind of stuff. Um, the canned fish, I don't know why that's on like the choose less often because we just said to eat more often. I would just make sure that the canned fish that you're buying is in water instead of oil, as I mentioned. Choose less often the canned foods packed in broth or salt. Um, those are just going to have a lot of sodium in them, so just be mindful. Choose less often like the saltier cheeses, like American cheese. American cheese is one of the most processed and sodium heavy cheeses. I know Land O'Lakes, when you go to the deli, they sometimes have like a reduced sodium version of the cheese. So if you are getting American cheese, I would just try to get the lower sodium option. Choose less often the salty chips, crackers, nuts, popcorn, and pretzels. Those types of snack foods are just so processed. They're going to have a lot of added salt for taste and the way that they're processed and as a preservative. So just kind of limit those. Limit the quick cooking rice and noodles. Those are just going to have a lot more sodium in them than the regular versions of them. Regular canned and instant soups, those have so much sodium in them. So as I mentioned, trying to choose the soups that have that kind of stamp on them that tells you that they're lower in sodium or it's the heart healthy version of the soup. Canned vegetables, we want to choose less often unless you can get the no salt added or the lower sodium version, or you're going to rinse them before you eat them. And then choose less often the condiments and seasonings such as soy sauce, MSG, fish sauce, bouillon cubes, ketchup, and Cajun seasonings. Those just have so much sodium in them. I know I actually saw there at the grocery store, they have like bouillon powders instead of the cubes, which actually have no salt added. So that could be an option, along with the reduced sodium versions of soy sauce. And I don't use soy sauce. I use something that's called coconut aminos. It's in the Oriental aisle with the other soy sauces. But the coconut aminos are so much lower in sodium, and they're also soy free for anyone that has a soy allergy and kind of wants to make those Oriental dishes. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. You use it just like soy sauce, and it still gives you that same flavor profile. So it's a really good low sodium option instead of soy sauce. And then with the other condiments, there's a lot of brands that make the lower sodium versions now, which is really helpful. So by adopting the habit of reading food labels, you can choose foods more wisely. So like we've been talking about, watch for foods that have high levels of saturated fat or trans fat, or that include any hydrogenated fats, because these can all raise your cholesterol levels. And watch for foods that are high in sodium, as these can increase your blood pressure. And on average, the higher your salt intake, the higher your blood pressure. So salt is kind of, when I think heart healthy, I really try to be mindful of salt because I think that has the most direct impact on your blood pressure. So really watching your sodium intake. So when reading labels, there's certain key terms that you can watch for. So there's things that say free, very low or low, reduced or less. So it's important to read the food label and determine the sodium content of food, which can vary by several hundreds of milligrams in similar foods. For example, the sodium content in a regular canned tomato soup may be 700 milligrams of sodium per cup in one brand, but then another brand that's essentially the same thing can have as high as 1,000 milligrams per cup. So just something to keep in mind. So it's also important to understand the different statements and claims on the labels, as I mentioned, like that free, very low, reduced, less. So we're kind of going to go over, I'm going to go over those and tell you what they kind of mean. So the free examples are like the statements that say like cholesterol free, fat free, dairy free. So if you're looking to avoid certain dietary elements, then that free claim is going to be your best choice. Some very low and low examples are like very low sodium, low fat, low cholesterol. So those can be helpful, again, if you're looking to reduce a certain component. So then reduced or less, that can be something like reduced carbs, less sugar, reduced fat. These terms mean that the food has 25% less of that nutrient than the original food product. So if you see something, for example, that says like reduced sugar on peanut butter, it means that that version has at least 25% less sugar than the regular peanut butter. But it's still a good idea to check the food label to see exactly how the components that product has, like the fat, the sodium, cholesterol, even if they kind of snap that plain to see how much is actually. So this slide is kind of just showing you a comparison and kind of pointing out some components of the nutrition label. So we have frozen peas compared to canned peas. So you can see that the serving size is half a cup on each label. So comparing serving sizes is a big one because you can sometimes look at the label and be like, oh, like this doesn't have that much sodium in it compared to this brand, but then you look at the serving size and it's completely different. So it can kind of be confusing. But generally the nutrition label is going to have that serving size. So the components that are on the label are for one serving. So basically, I'm sure everybody already knows this, but if you eat more or less than that serving, you kind of got to add or subtract based on what they provide for that one serving. So for example, if you eat 1 cup of peas, you need to double the nutrient amounts on the label because the serving size is only half a cup. So if you're eating a cup, that's 2 servings. So then the nutrition label kind of goes through all the components of what's in there. And then the percent daily value is kind of helpful. It helps you compare products and tells you if the food is high or low in sodium and other components. So you can kind of compare. So for example, the frozen peas in terms of sodium, so the frozen ones are only 5% of the daily value, which is based off of the dietary recommendations for how much sodium you should have. So that should be based on like that 2,300 milligrams that we want to stay under. So that sodium is 5% of that 2,300 milligrams compared to the canned peas that are 16% of that 2,300 milligrams. So you can kind of compare if something has a higher percent daily value, it just has a higher amount of that component in the product. So this is comparing another food product. So when looking at the nutrition label, going through all the components, which type of cereal is going to be overall more healthy? So we can go through, there's a calorie difference between the two, there's a fat difference, there's definitely a sodium difference, total carbs, fiber, sugar, and protein, all of these are so different. when you compare these two products. So looking at these labels, which breakfast cereal do we think is the healthier choice? So it's definitely going to be the mixed berry cereal crunch, due to the fact that it has less calories, less sodium, less sugar, compared to the frosted oats, and it also has more protein, potassium, and more vitamins and minerals. So protein is also something to look for on the label, because protein helps keep you full longer. So that can kind of help reduce your cravings between meals to snack. And potassium is also important for reducing blood pressure. So that's something else to look for on the label to see how much potassium is in a product. Okay, so this is just a slide that I wanted to include because in 2020, the Food and Drug Administration actually updated the nutrition label. So if we go back, you can definitely tell that there's a difference in how the nutrition label looks. So what they changed is the serving size appears in larger, bold font, and some of the serving sizes have been updated on certain products to kind of make the serving size more realistic to what somebody's actually eating. The calories are also displayed in bigger and bolder font, and the daily values have also been updated. And then another thing is that they included something that says added sugars. So this can be helpful, especially like a good example is if you're buying fruit juice. So you can tell if you're buying like a juice cocktail, there's going to be a lot of sugar that's under this added sugar category, versus if you buy 100% fruit juice, there's going to be less of that added sugar because it's more of the naturally occurring sugar that's in the fruit itself. So that's something to be mindful of. And the added sugar is also kind of that like that high fructose corn syrup that's added. So if you don't want that in your diet, you can see and look on the nutrition label and see if the product has added sugar in it versus the sugar that's naturally occurring in the food that's in that product. So vitamin D and potassium are now listed on the label as well. Manufacturers must declare the amount in addition to present daily value for vitamins and minerals now, which is really, really helpful. Okay, so now once we've done the grocery shopping, now we've got to prepare the food, right? So once you've shopped for your food, it's time to prepare it. And there's many ways that you can prepare healthy food that's low in sodium without losing any of the flavor. I think that's a lot of times what kind of holds people back, is because when we salt foods, it adds so much flavor. But we can get that same amount of flavor by flavoring our foods with those salt-free seasoning blends, fresh or dried herbs and spices, or lemon juice, lime juice, some of those citrus things. Cooking rice and pasta and hot cereal without salt. In my opinion, I don't really think that putting salt in the water really adds that much flavor. So it's really easy to just kind of do without that, and that can significantly reduce the sodium content in your foods. So as I've mentioned, rinsing your canned foods, such as your vegetables and beans, to remove the sodium, and just take the salt shaker off the table and keep it out of like your prep area when you're cooking. That can also help. Okay, so I've been talking about these herbs and spices. So how can we use them in everyday foods? So many herbs and spices are very versatile, so you can use them in a lot of different dishes. So some of the common ones is basil. That's kind of one of those like Italian herbs. So you can definitely use those in soups, salads. You can put it on vegetables and meats. Cinnamon is going to be sweeter and more savory. But you can definitely put them on salads, on vegetables, bread, and snacks. Like sweet potatoes and butternut squash have a really good flavor profile with cinnamon. So that's something that you can use cinnamon for. Chili powder, soup, salads, vegetables, fish. Cloves is kind of like cinnamon in that it's like a sweet and savory, but you can definitely use it in soup, salads, and vegetables. We have dill weed and dill seed. That kind of gives you like kind of like that pickle flavor a little bit. So you can use that with fish. Goes really well with fish, soup, salads, and vegetables. Ginger is going to be more on that like savory side. Soup, salad, vegetables, and meats, definitely with those like oriental type dishes. Marjoram you can use for soup, salads, vegetables, beef, fish, chicken. Nutmeg is kind of like the cloves and cinnamon. Can use it with vegetables, meats, and snacks. Oregano and parsley are some of those Italian herbs, like basil, so you can use that on a lot of things. Rosemary. Rosemary goes really good with fish as well, but you can definitely put that on salad, vegetables, and meats. Sage and thyme, definitely salad, soups, vegetables, any type of meats. So all these kinds of herbs and spices can really be used on a lot of things, which is nice. You don't have to buy all these separate spices to do the cooking because they can be used on a variety of things. So what are some other ways that we can reduce our sodium intake at home? So we can substitute butter and oil with water or low sodium broths for sauteing. I do recommend, if you're going to use oil, to try to use like olive oil or canola oil. Those are some of the heart healthy oils, but they do tend to add a lot of calories. Even if you're just sauteing with them, because it soaks into the food and it can add more calories than we think. So just be mindful. Using lower fat substitutions in recipes. So a good example of that is if we're making like a homemade cheesecake, you can use the lower fat version of cream cheese. Use reduced fat and low sodium condiments when available. You can substitute mayonnaise or sour cream with Greek yogurt or cottage cheese to kind of reduce the fat content. And then substitute fatty meats with beans and other vegetables in recipes. So another thing, if you don't want to add any sodium at all, you can use some of that olive oil or canola oil to saute instead of the broth that I mentioned for sauteing. Because even like the unsalted versions of the broth are still gonna have some salt in them. Just definitely not anywhere near the broths that are salted. But if you don't want to add any salt, I would stick to using those heart healthy oils. And also don't be afraid to modify your recipes if they call for a lot of fat and salt. Use lower fat versions, substitute things. Like for example, you can substitute like applesauce for oil in a recipe when you're baking. Things like that to kind of reduce fat content, and make substitutions and experiment with herbs and spices to create something new. I mean, you never know if you're going to like something unless you try it. So don't be afraid to kind of experiment. So then, I mean, when you're cooking, you got to have the right cooking tools, right? So nonstick cookware allows you to cook without adding butter or other added fat. One thing I have noticed though is if your nonstick cookware gets scratched, it kind of takes away some of that nonstick ability, and you might have to add some oil. So definitely when you're using the nonstick pots and pans, try not to use metal utensils. So I recommend using like some of those like silicone spoons and spatulas and stuff like that to reduce the amount of scratches that you're going to get on your pans when you're cooking. A vegetable steamer allows you to cook vegetables without adding fat. Steaming vegetables also helps retain the vitamins and minerals compared to sauteing them. And then a spice turntable or a garlic press can help make it easier to prepare foods with all the spices and herbs that you need in one spot. And then the garlic press is kind of really convenient to help mince your garlic instead of having to take the time to chop it. So that could be a good tool to use. All right, so now we're kind of going to practice some of the strategies that I've talked about and try to make a recipe a little healthier. So the recipe I have is a taco pizza. So just looking at this recipe, can you identify 5 modifications that can be made to create a healthier version of this taco pizza? So some items to consider are the ground beef, the packaged taco seasoning, the croissant rolls, the refried beans, the cheese, the black olives. So just take a second to look at this recipe and see if on your own you can identify things that can make it a little bit healthier. One thing also to mention is that canned refried beans are very high in sodium. So oftentimes people might make their own version. So I have a quick little recipe if you want to make your own refried beans. So if you heat olive oil over medium heat in a skillet, and then you can add onion, garlic, some bell peppers if you're using them, and kind of cook those for about 4 to 5 minutes until the onion turns translucent and gets a little soft. And then you can add your rinsed canned beans if you wanted, and some broth, and you can cook those down for about 5 minutes until the beans are warm, and you can kind of like mash everything up and kind of make your own version of those mashed refried beans. So just something to consider if you want to stay away from those canned beans. All right, so going back to this taco recipe. So some of the things you can modify with the ground beef, you can use a leaner version like that 93%, or yeah, I think it's 93% ground beef, or you can use the 98% really lean ground turkey instead. For the taco seasoning mixed, they do make reduced sodium versions. So you can get those, or if you can't find the reduced sodium version, you can just use half the seasoning packet to kind of reduce the amount of salt. For the croissant rolls, you can use the reduced fat version. The refried beans, you can either not use them, or you can make kind of make your own version. The shredded cheddar cheese, you can use the reduced fat version of the cheddar cheese, or any other reduced fat cheese, doesn't need to be cheddar. I would definitely, you don't need to make any changes to the tomatoes. The black olives, I would just rinse and drain them first. And then no changes need to be made to the green onions. If you don't want to use the refried beans also, you can just kind of increase your vegetables like the tomatoes and onions to still give your taco pizza a little bit of flavor. All right. Well, since we're over Zoom, can't really have a discussion, but I'm just gonna pose some questions to just kind of think about on your own time. So think about how you currently prepare to shop for food. Do you plan meals for the week ahead of time? Do you make a grocery list? What items can you substitute to make your choices more blood pressure friendly? For example, like salts versus herbs and spices, salted and unsalted versions of foods, the reduced sodium versions. And then think about how you currently prepare your food at home. Do you use fresh ingredients? What blood pressure friendly techniques would you consider using moving forward now that we've kind of talked about it? What are some of your favorite recipes? Which ingredients may contribute to higher blood pressure? Um, how can you modify the recipe to be more blood pressure friendly? Using those lower fat options and kind of omitting the salt and using low sodium versions. So now we're just going to go over physical activity and how that can help with blood pressure management in addition to food. So I know I've mentioned this in previous seminars, but I just want to reiterate that there is evidence to show that regular physical activity can lead to a significant reduction in blood pressure and improve those other cardiovascular risks. So moderate physical activity has also been proven to decrease blood pressure in those who already have high blood pressure, who are less responsive to kind of like those medications that help treat blood pressure and cholesterol and everything else. So 30 minutes of physical activity a day, equivalent to a brisk walk 6 to 7 days a week, can help better manage or reduce your blood pressure. If you don't want to do that fast-paced brisk walk and you want to just kind of take a leisurely stroll through the neighborhood or whatnot, I would just kind of increase the amount of time you're doing it. So maybe around 45 minutes instead of a half an hour. Just kind of get that heart pumping a little bit and get some exercise going. So then again, this is just a list of the studies that were used to kind of make those exercise claims. Yeah, so that's all I have for you. If you have any questions about anything that we've talked about, feel free to email me. My email is at the bottom. And I just wanted to also remind you to monitor your blood pressure and attend the office hours and keep doing what you're doing to help manage your blood pressure. All right. All right. Thank you, everybody.